I thought I knew my wife, Rachel, until one night shattered everything I believed about our marriage. What began as a quiet return home turned into a discovery so devastating, it unraveled secrets that would change my life forever. As I scanned the bustling restaurant for the client I was scheduled to meet, my eyes unexpectedly landed on Lisa, my ex-wife. She was seated across from a slightly stocky middle-aged man who carried himself with an air of affluence. It was clear he had once been fit, but the passage of time and a life of indulgence had softened his frame. Lisa, sitting beside him, exuded an aura of contentment that made her seem more vibrant than I remembered. Every detail about the man, from his tailored suit to his polished watch, hinted at wealth and sophistication. Standing there in the foyer, I found myself momentarily frozen as memories of Lisa and our time together surged to the surface. It had been 3 years since our divorce, yet the emotions remained vivid, as though everything had unfolded just yesterday. Watching her from a distance, I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, wondering how I'd come to this moment, an observer of her happiness rather than a participant in it. But life has a cruel way of turning moments of nostalgia into bitter realizations. Her dreams had seemingly been fulfilled, while mine had become a series of troubles that began with a fateful trip to Albany. It was supposed to be a routine business meeting. I had planned to stay overnight to avoid a late-night drive back. But shortly after setting off, my phone buzzed with a call from the client. Apologetically, he explained that an accident, though minor, had damaged his car, and he had to cancel our meeting. He sounded genuinely regretful, and I assured him it wasn't an issue, suggesting we reschedule. Still, I was unprepared for the 2-hour drive back home, compounded by the frustration of having the evening's plans upended. Determined to salvage the day, I decided I'd surprise my wife with a romantic dinner instead. As I neared home, the glow of the streetlights illuminated the sight of 3 unfamiliar cars parked in our driveway. At first, I thought little of it. Rachel often hosted her friends when I was out, so I assumed she had planned a gathering to keep herself entertained in my absence. Parking on the street, I walked toward the house with no hint of suspicion. But the moment I stepped inside, the scattered evidence in the living room stopped me cold. 4 sets of clothing, none of which belonged to me or Rachel, lay strewn across the floor. An uneasy feeling gripped me, but it wasn't until I heard her voice from upstairs that the truth struck with devastating clarity. Her cries weren't ones of distress, they were unmistakable, intimate sounds of passion, cries I once believed were meant only for me. My chest tightened, and my legs felt as though they might give way under the weight of the realization. Rachel was upstairs with someone else. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and leave, to spare myself from the pain of witnessing what awaited me. But something compelled me to face it head-on, even though I already knew what I would find. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I climbed the final steps, the muffled sounds from the bedroom became unmistakable, a raw, primal scream that made my stomach twist. Steeling myself, I edged closer to the slightly ajar door, cautiously peeking around the frame. What I saw will haunt me forever. There, in the room that once held our dreams and shared memories, was my wife, Rachel, entwined with 3 men. 2 were strangers to me, but the third face struck me like a thunderbolt. It was her boss, Greg Thompson, the same man whose name she'd often mentioned at the dinner table. Shock gave way to disgust as Greg's voice reached my ears, lavishly praising Rachel for her contributions to his work. But the way he spoke made it clear that this wasn't gratitude, it was exploitation. He was using her, manipulating her for his professional gain while degrading her in ways I never imagined possible. The scene unfolding before me felt surreal. The woman I had loved and cherished for over a decade seemed like a stranger, a distorted reflection of the partner I thought I knew. I couldn't ignore Greg's vile words, nor could I disagree with the demeaning labels he threw at her. Rachel's behavior, so far removed from the person I had married, was almost unrecognizable. Overwhelmed and nauseated, I carefully retreated down the stairs, ensuring my presence remained unnoticed. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. I slipped into my office, my sanctuary, and sat for a moment to collect myself. Then an idea came to me, a decision born not out of malice, but necessity. I retrieved my digital video camera from a drawer, thankful to find it charged and ready to use. There was an old vacation cassette inside, but enough room remained for new recordings. This wasn't about creating some voyeuristic spectacle, I needed evidence, for legal protection and for my own sanity. Returning upstairs with trembling hands, I positioned the camera discreetly at the edge of the doorframe, focusing it to capture Rachel's face and the identities of the others. I pressed record and stepped away, my heart pounding in my chest. I could only endure the sight and sounds for a few minutes before the weight of my emotions overwhelmed me. Where others might see something titillating, all I felt was crushing sadness and an unbearable sense of betrayal. My breath hitched as tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I turned away and retreated once more to the office, desperate for air and clarity. Sitting in the dim light of the room, I opened my safe and withdrew my firearm, releasing the safety. Though I am not a violent man, the thought of asserting myself in this devastating moment felt like a lifeline. It wasn't anger that drove me, it was a desperate need to regain control of the chaos spiraling around me. But reason tempered my instincts. Instead, I decided to play my hand differently. I made my way to the living room, gathering the wallets and car keys from the pants discarded on the floor. One by one, I deflated the tires of every vehicle in the driveway, including Rachel's. My actions felt calculated, almost mechanical, as I worked through the anger bubbling under the surface. Returning to the house, a grim sense of satisfaction settled over me. I spotted Rachel's phone on the bedside table during my earlier recording session and knew it was integral to my plan. Settling discreetly behind the staircase, I dialed her number. It took several attempts before she finally answered, her voice breathless and tinged with unease. "Hey, Danny. How's the trip to Albany?" I heard faint chuckles in the background, and her words only deepened the ache in my chest. "You sound out of breath, Rachel. Are you okay?" I asked, my tone steady but edged with quiet tension. The silence in the house confirmed that she had warned the others to remain quiet. The weight of the charade she tried to maintain pressed heavily on me, but I held firm, waiting to see what would unfold next. Feigning concern, I softened my tone and asked, "Are you okay? You sound out of breath." "Yes," Rachel replied quickly, her voice regaining composure. "Had to rush upstairs to grab my phone. Well, my client cancelled, so I'm heading home now," I said evenly, masking the turmoil raging within me. "Maybe we could do dinner tonight?" Rachel hesitated for a moment. "Heading home now?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "Sounds good. Just need to get ready, babe." "See you soon," I replied, my calm tone betraying none of the agitation I felt. "Okay," she answered hurriedly, then ended the call abruptly. A knowing smile crept onto my face. The events I had set in motion were about to unfold. Just as anticipated, within moments, the sound of footsteps on the stairs reached my ears. One by one, the four figures emerged, hurriedly making their way into the living room. The three men, now fully aware of the time, hastily dressed, while Rachel scrambled to straighten herself and slip into a pair of shoes and a jacket. From the porch, Rachel peeked out nervously, her attention focused entirely on ensuring her guests departed before she made her own exit. Had she been less preoccupied, she might have noticed my car parked just down the street. The men seemed frazzled, speaking over one another in raised voices as Rachel stepped onto the porch to try to calm them. That's when I struck. Moving swiftly, I slammed the front door shut and locked it behind her. Rachel caught a glimpse of my face through the closing door, her expression morphing into one of shock and desperation. She rushed to the side window, gesturing frantically and calling out, her voice laced with panic. "Danny, wait. Please, let's talk." But the time for discussion had long since passed. The commotion attracted the attention of the three men, who quickly returned to the porch. They began pounding on the door, shouting demands to retrieve their belongings. Their racket echoed through the neighborhood, but I remained resolute. Pulling out my phone, I dialed 911. "I'd like to report an attempted break-in at my home," I told the dispatcher. Calmly, I provided my name and address. To my surprise, she informed me that a neighbor had already called, reporting the disturbance. The police were en route and would arrive shortly. Within 2 minutes, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the scene. 2 officers stepped out, their presence silencing the chaos momentarily. The officers began questioning Rachel, who stood awkwardly on the porch, avoiding my gaze. I approached the officers and made my case, stating firmly, "These men mistreated my wife. I demand their arrest." My accusation sent the men into a frenzy. "That's not true," one of them shouted, his voice rising defensively. "She invited us here, she agreed to everything. She was fine with it," another added, glaring in frustration. There was no mistreatment. All eyes turned to Rachel, who stood trembling under the weight of the confrontation. Her face flushed with shame as she struggled to form a response. Finally, in a subdued voice, she admitted, I invited them. It was all consensual." Her words hung heavily in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. I said nothing, allowing her admission to linger. Her gaze never met mine, and the guilt radiating from her was palpable. Whatever she might have said next, it no longer mattered. The foundation of our marriage was shattered, and with it, any semblance of trust or understanding we once had. "I'm deeply sorry," Rachel began, her voice trembling as tears welled in her eyes. But I raised my hand sharply, cutting her off. "Don't even try," I said coldly. "You've shattered my heart, Rachel, and I'll never forgive you. Greg called you a strumpet, and honestly, I think it fits. From now on, I won't even use your real name. If you need to communicate with me for any reason, do it through Tad." Without waiting for her response, I turned my back and retreated into the house, locking the door behind me. From the window, I caught a glimpse of her collapsing into sobs, hurrying back to the group of men on the porch. The sight brought no comfort, only a hollow ache. Determined to rid myself of every trace of her, I returned to the bedroom and began methodically removing each drawer from the dresser, hauling them outside along with the rest of her belongings. But when I reached the bottom drawer, I encountered resistance. Fueled by anger, I yanked at it with all my strength, hearing the wood crack before the drawer finally gave way. What I uncovered made my stomach turn. Hidden beneath the drawer was a small stack of DVDs, 7 or 8 in total. One of the plastic cases had cracked under my forceful tug, but the disc inside was intact. I picked it up hesitantly, my heart sinking as I realized what I had found. Each disc had handwritten labels with cryptic, suggestive titles. A closer look revealed they were recordings of Rachel's secret life, intimate encounters she had carefully documented. One disc even bore Greg's name, a nauseating confirmation of how deeply entwined he had been in her betrayal. The man celebrated in newspapers for his philanthropic work had, it seemed, extended his influence into my wife's private affairs. Reeling from this discovery, I gathered the DVDs, along with the cassette tape I had recorded earlier in Rachel's cell phone, and placed them carefully into a large envelope. I knew immediately who I needed to speak to, Ted Worth, my trusted lawyer and closest confidant of many years. Aside from Ted was one of the only people I could truly rely on, and I needed his guidance now more than ever. As I sealed the envelope, my eyes fell on Rachel's computer sitting on the desk. With little hesitation, I opened it, hoping to uncover more about the life she had been hiding. My breath caught as I read a recent email draft, addressed to someone named Sarah. "I have no interest in Greg anymore, but Danny. He's faithful, though foolish. I fear he'll uncover my secret lifestyle soon. He's not entirely clueless, but love has blinded him. Lately, he's been gaining weight, and his growing belly is off-putting. Comparing him to other men, he's lacking. I also detest his beard and mustache, they make him look so unappealing. I once loved him deeply, but the excitement of these recent years is too intoxicating to give up. The words were like daggers. Any hope of salvaging even a shred of respect for Rachel dissolved in that moment. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, plagued by restless sleep and nightmares of betrayal. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. I called in sick to work and immediately reached out to Ted's office. His longtime secretary, Mary, answered the phone. "Morning, Danny," she said warmly. "Ted's tied up in court all day." "Mary, please," I interrupted urgently. "I need to see him. It's important." Mary, ever the problem solver, replied, "I'll pass along the message and tell him you need to meet at the office in an hour. If he starts giving me any nonsense about his schedule, I'll bring up Tammy Brown's name. Trust me, that'll get his attention. See you soon, Danny." As I ended the call, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. I had the evidence, and I had Ted. Now, I needed to prepare for the battle that was sure to come. I ended the call with a wry smile, stepping out into the yard to take in the chaos I had orchestrated. Rachel's broken bed frame and clothes were scattered across the lawn, like relics of a bizarre yard sale. My elderly neighbor waved cautiously, her curious expression speaking volumes. I could already imagine the chatter spreading through the neighborhood. It wouldn't be long before this turned into the suburban scandal of the season. Needing a moment to clear my head, I headed to the city center, grabbing a quick bite to eat before making my way to Ted's office. Mary, Ted's loyal secretary and someone I'd known for years, greeted me warmly. She handed me a cup of coffee, plenty of cream, no sugar, just the way I liked it. "Danny, you wouldn't believe it," she said with a chuckle. "I dropped Ted's name, and suddenly Ted cleared his entire day for you. He even canceled a meeting." "Mary, you're a lifesaver," I replied with a tired grin. Ted ushered me into his office not long after. Once we sat down, he leaned forward with a serious expression. "Danny, I've known you for a long time, and I can see how devastated you are. But let me ask, do you see any chance of reconciling with Rachel?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Ted, if this were Katie, your wife, and you found the kind of videos and emails I did, you'd be gone before she could blink." Ted nodded slowly. "Fair enough. So, what's the plan here? What do you want to achieve?" "I want a divorce," I said, my tone hardening. "But I'm not walking away quietly. She betrayed me, Ted. I want to make sure it costs her." Ted sat back, considering my words. "All right, first steps. We'll explore legal options against Greg and that tennis club he runs. As for Sarah, unless she's directly involved, she's not worth pursuing. And Rachel? She's getting nothing," I said firmly. "And if Greg wants to settle this quietly, he better come with at least $2 million. Anything less, and I'm not interested." Ted smirked. "Danny, you know my rates. Let's push for $2.5 million, I'll make sure it's worth every penny." I managed a small chuckle. "Fine by me. Let's do it." Ted's tone softened as he leaned forward. "Listen, Danny. Why don't you come by tonight? Katie's cooking dinner, and I think you need a break from all this. Let us take care of you for a night." "I might just take you up on that," I said, grateful for his support. Before I could leave, Mary popped her head in. "Ted, line one's for you," she said. Ted scowled. "I told you, no calls," he snapped before turning back to me. "Sorry, Danny. Let's pick this up again soon." I glanced at my watch. "I've got an appointment with Bill Evans at 2 p.m. to start filing the papers. After that, we'll see where this goes." Ted sighed. "This isn't going to be pleasant, Danny. Rachel's already caused you so much pain, and if she fights back, it'll get worse. But you're not alone in this, I've got your back." I stood to leave, nodding in appreciation. "Thanks, Ted. That means everything. As I made my way down the hall, I caught part of Ted's conversation over the phone. His voice was resolute. Rachel, listen to me, he said. Danny isn't interested in excuses. You've shattered him, and I doubt your tears will sway him now. My advice? Find a good lawyer, you're going to need one. And stay away from the house. It's not safe for you to be there right now. Ted paused for a moment before continuing. Stay with Sarah or whoever you trust, but don't push Danny any further. You're lucky he's handling this as calmly as he is. Hearing Ted's words reaffirmed my resolve. With him in my corner, I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about reclaiming my dignity and moving forward. I gave Ted a puzzled look as he finished speaking. He noticed my confusion and quickly responded, his tone firm yet empathetic. Danny, I think it's best if I review the footage myself to spare you from any further distress, at least for now. Watching this material won't do you any good, especially not before our meeting with Bill Evans at 2 p.m. Trust me, you don't need to see it yet. Though reluctant, I nodded in agreement. You're probably right, I admitted. Honestly, I'm not sure I could stomach watching it without wanting to lash out or worse. Ted gave me a grim smile. Brace yourself, though. Towards the end of the footage, just after Tony and Rachel finish in the men's locker room at the tennis club, he hesitated, then continued delicately, a small crowd gathers. And Rachel, she lets the other men who were watching join in after Tony. I hate telling you this, but you need to understand the full extent of what's going on here. His words landed like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and I struggled to catch my breath. You're not telling me this just to hurt me, are you? I asked quietly. Ted shook his head. No, Danny. I want you to see who we're dealing with. Look at this guy here, he said, pointing at the screen on his desk. The older man he indicated was unfamiliar to me, but the disdain in Ted's voice made it clear this wasn't just another face in the crowd. Who is he? I asked, my voice shaky. That's Bill Evans, Ted replied grimly. The same Bill Evans we're meeting at 2 p.m. He's not just representing the tennis club, he's directly involved. And now we have proof. The weight of Ted's words settled heavily on me. The very man I was supposed to meet with was deeply entwined in Rachel's betrayal. A few hours later, Ted and I arrived at Bill's office, a lavishly decorated space adorned with opulent furniture, polished wood paneling, and walls lined with plaques, awards, and framed photographs of Bill with various influential figures. Just before we entered, I had an eerie sense that someone was watching me. Glancing down the hallway, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a woman disappearing around the corner. Rachel. For a moment, I braced myself, expecting a confrontation, but she didn't return. Relieved, I refocused on the task at hand and stepped into the room with Ted. Bill greeted us with a polished smile, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Danny, Ted, please have a seat, he said, gesturing to the plush chairs opposite his grand desk. First, let me express my sincere apologies for the events that have unfolded. I understand last night must have been awful for you. Let's work together to find a resolution that benefits all parties. I remained silent, my expression neutral, as Ted took the lead. We appreciate the sentiment, Bill, but let's cut to the chase. Danny isn't here for apologies, he's here for accountability. Just as Ted finished speaking, Bill pressed the intercom button. Julie, get Jeff in here immediately. Tell him to drop everything and come now. Yes, Mr. Evans, the voice on the intercom replied. Moments later, Ted leaned forward, his tone colder. Bill, before Jeff gets here, I think you should see this. He slid the envelope across the desk and nodded toward the contents. As Bill opened it and glanced at the materials inside, the color drained from his face. His hands shook slightly as he flipped through the photos and watched a snippet of the footage Ted had prepared. The images left no room for doubt. Bill and Jeff were both clearly involved with Rachel, their identities unmistakable. Bill exhaled slowly, setting the materials back on his desk. This changes things, he admitted, his polished demeanor cracking. Right, it does, Ted said, his voice firm. You're not just dealing with a client here, Bill. You're dealing with the consequences of your actions. Danny has every right to pursue this to the fullest extent. I stayed quiet, letting Ted handle the negotiation. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, but for now, I knew the evidence, and Ted, were more powerful than any words I could say. The room was silent, heavy with tension, as we waited for Bill's response. As the video continued playing in Bill's office, I couldn't help but notice the familiarity in his expression. He recognized the boardroom table where he and Rachel had been repeatedly involved in their illicit acts. Bill turned to Jeff, his tone sharp and incredulous. Jeff, are you seriously telling me that you were foolish enough to record this on video and hand out copies? Jeff sat frozen, his face drained of color and his mouth hanging open. He didn't have an answer, which only seemed to infuriate Bill further. Ted leaned in, his voice calm but cutting. Bill, let's not kid ourselves here. Jeff doesn't need to watch the tape, he's all over it. And you? Well, the footage speaks for itself. Bill stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape, clearly calculating the fallout. His mind was undoubtedly racing, trying to figure out how to salvage his business, his reputation, and his family life, all of which were now dangling by a thread. After a tense silence, Bill finally turned to Jeff. Once these gentlemen leave, we're going to have a serious discussion about your future employment here. And believe me, I'll be consulting with my legal team before I take another step. Meanwhile, I caught sight of Rachel lurking near the hallway, attempting to eavesdrop on our conversation. She wasn't as discreet as she thought, and Ted's sharp gaze caught her too. Just as we were stepping out, Bill slammed the intercom button and barked into it, "Julie, get Sue Thomas in here immediately." A grin spread across my face as Ted and I left. I knew Bill's office was about to turn into a battlefield, and the chaos ahead was well deserved. Outside, I turned to Ted with a question that had been bugging me. Why did you give Jeff an escape route? Suggesting he could use the tape against Bill. Ted smirked knowingly. Divide and conquer, Danny. If Jeff and Bill stay united, they'll fight back harder. But if they're too busy saving their own skins, it weakens their defense. Jeff's reckless, but Bill? He's got a sharp legal team. This way, their alliance crumbles. I nodded, starting to see the logic. And what's next? Ted's tone turned serious. Tomorrow, I'll call Bill and make it clear, no lowball offers. We're proposing $3 million, or we'll walk away from negotiations entirely. If he refuses, we'll escalate, and I need your permission to go all in. All in? I asked. Ted nodded. If this goes to court, we won't hold back. I'll cast Rachel in the worst possible light, using footage, photos, whatever it takes. Don't worry about explicit details, we'll handle it tactfully, but the truth will come out. I sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the situation. Ted, you've always had my back, and I trust you. Do whatever you need to. I just wish I hadn't been so blind to all this. Being an oblivious husband was easier than being a public fool. Ted placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Danny, you didn't start this mess. But trust me, you'll be the one to finish it. Later, Ted and I approached the manager of the tennis club, Harry Riel, to address Tony's role in the scandal. Ted wasted no time. Mr. Riel, we've uncovered that Tony Simba, your tennis instructor, has been having an affair with Mrs. Thomas. What are you going to do about this? Riel barely flinched. His expression was icy as he replied, what two consenting adults do behind closed doors is none of my business. Turning to me, he added coldly, and if you can't satisfy your wife in the bedroom, Mr. Thomas, don't expect my club to step in." Ted clenched his jaw but stayed composed. "Mr. Riel, when this information gets out, every dues-paying member of your club is going to wonder if their wife is involved in similar activities while they foot the bill. Are you prepared for that kind of fallout?" Riel's face tightened, but he didn't respond. The silence spoke volumes. As Ted and I left the club, a small flicker of satisfaction rose within me. The damage to Riel's carefully curated reputation was inevitable, and I knew this was only the beginning. With Ted leading the charge, I finally felt like I was regaining some control over the chaos. Ted leaned back in his chair, adopting an almost storyteller's tone. "Danny, once we subpoena everyone present in the locker room that day, we're going to have quite the spectacle on our hands. Imagine the fallout for married men caught up in this mess. They won't be too pleased with you, Harry," he said, clearly savoring the thought. "And then there's the legal issue of a reasonable expectation of privacy when filming in the locker room. By the time I'm done, your club might not survive the week." Ted's confidence was justified. Within days, Bill Evans had offered nearly $2.7 million to settle the case and retain Rachel as his employee. It seemed he was more interested in keeping her on his side than risking further exposure. Jeff Davis, however, wasn't so lucky. After naively handing over all his tapes to Bill, Jeff found himself summarily fired. With little recourse and a tarnished reputation, he faded into obscurity. I wasn't done yet. The two other men who had been with Rachel the night I caught her with Jeff weren't just random individuals, they were two of Jeff's major clients. Neither wanted their names associated with a public scandal, fearing the damage it could do to their personal lives and their companies. Each quietly offered generous settlements to avoid the spotlight, and I accepted. Weeks later, I found myself back in the city center, waiting for a meeting with new business associates. As I stood there lost in thought, the manager approached me. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice pulling me back to the present. I shook my head to clear it. "Apologies," I said, offering a small smile. "I was just reminiscing about an old issue. Thanks again for checking in." The manager gave me a curious glance, the kind people reserve for someone who seems out of place. I felt like an elderly man, momentarily adrift in the past, but I shook it off. Once I spotted the group I had come to meet, I thanked him again and turned my focus back to the task at hand. But before I left, something caught my eye: Rachel, sitting at a table nearby with a man who could only be described as her new fiancé. Her surprise was evident when our eyes met. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach. When we last saw each other, I was overweight, crushed under the weight of her betrayal. Now, I walked taller, with clarity and purpose that I had lacked for years. Rachel's fiancé rose to meet me, his face unreadable. "Why don't you go freshen up, Rachel?" he said curtly. "I'll handle this." Rachel stood, locking eyes with me for a moment. Her tears began to fall, surprising me. Was it guilt? Lingering sentiment? Likely a mix of both. "I expect you to be gone when I return," she said tearfully before heading toward the restroom. As she walked away, I noticed the sizable engagement ring on her finger, a sharp contrast to the hollow expression she wore. Turning back to her fiancé, I fixed him with a calm but unrelenting gaze. "Does she still take tennis lessons on Saturdays?" I asked. "She plays on Sundays," he snapped, his confidence flickering. "You seem to have a hazy memory for someone married to her for so long." I gave a bitter smile. "Final question," I continued. "Have you ever checked under the bottom drawer of the dresser in your living room?" His brow furrowed in confusion. "No. Why would I even do that?" he asked defensively. "Let's just say," I replied quietly, "that those three questions are the reason we're no longer together." Without waiting for his response, I turned and left the restaurant. Later, I found myself thinking back to that email, Rachel's scathing words about me that had cut deeper than any other betrayal. Of all the evidence I had uncovered, that email was the hardest to accept. Her cruelty was raw, laid bare in her own handwriting. That's why I kept it, a stark reminder of the lessons learned and the person I would never allow to hurt me again. I heard later that Rachel's fiancé, Peter, had found something under the dresser drawer. Perhaps it was the same trove of DVDs and secrets I had uncovered, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, Rachel's tears in the restaurant suggested he had uncovered more than she intended.